What if the rules you followed every single day weren't your choice, but strict laws designed to control how you ate, how you worked, even who you could love? Under Hitler's rule, millions of Germans lived exactly like this. But here's the question: was there one law, hidden among many, that silently destroyed the very core of German society? In this video, we'll uncover how Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, reshaped every corner of life, and reveal the shocking rule at the end that no one dared to speak about. Stay with me, because the truth is more disturbing than you think. The birth of Hitler's laws, from democracy to dictatorship. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany, few could predict the speed and severity with which the Nazi regime would dismantle the existing democratic structures of the Weimar Republic. Germany had endured political instability, economic depression, and a humiliating defeat in World War I. Against this backdrop, Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, promised order, pride, and renewal. Yet, behind these promises lay an authoritarian vision that would soon be cemented through a carefully crafted set of laws and rules. The laws introduced under Hitler were not just bureaucratic measures. They were the very backbone of the Nazi state, mechanisms designed to control every aspect of life, from politics and the press to marriage, education, and even leisure. For ordinary Germans, the transformation was swift and disorienting. Overnight, freedoms that had existed under the Weimar Constitution were stripped away, replaced with strict controls that dictated how people could speak, work, believe, and even think. To understand how Hitler's laws changed German lives, we must begin with the legal foundations of Nazi rule. The Reichstag fire and the decree of February 1933. Only weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, a dramatic event shifted the course of German politics. The Reichstag fire. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament, went up in flames. A Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested at the scene, but historians still debate whether he acted alone or whether the Nazis orchestrated the fire to create a climate of fear. Whatever the truth, Hitler seized the opportunity. The very next day, President Paul von Hindenburg, under Hitler's urging, signed the Reichstag fire decree, officially titled the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State. Far from protecting the people, this decree suspended key civil liberties guaranteed by the Weimar Constitution. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly were abolished. The state was empowered to intercept mail, tap phones, and search homes without warrants. Political opponents, particularly communists and social democrats, could be detained indefinitely without trial. For ordinary Germans, this meant living under constant surveillance. A simple criticism of the government could lead to arrest. Neighborhoods began to whisper with fear, as people never knew who might report them to the authorities. The decree transformed Germany overnight from a constitutional democracy into a police state. The Enabling Act, legal dictatorship. If the Reichstag fire decree crippled freedom, the Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, destroyed democracy altogether. Officially called the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich, the Enabling Act gave Hitler and his cabinet the power to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag or even the president. In essence, it handed legislative power to Hitler's government, making parliamentary debate irrelevant. The vote to pass the Enabling Act took place in the Kroll Opera House, as the Reichstag building was still damaged by fire. Surrounded by Nazi stormtroopers who intimidated the opposition, most parties either supported the act or abstained, except for the Social Democrats, who bravely but unsuccessfully opposed it. The law passed with the required two-thirds majority, and with it, the Nazi dictatorship became fully legal. Hitler no longer needed to worry about parliamentary checks. He could issue decrees that carried the weight of law, and soon he would use this power to reshape Germany in his vision. Gleichschaltung, the coordination of society. With legislative power in his hands, Hitler embarked on a process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, meaning coordination or bringing into line. The idea was simple. Every aspect of German society, politics, economy, culture, and private life, had to conform to Nazi ideology. This was achieved through a combination of new laws, purges, and the restructuring of institutions. Political parties. The law against the formation of new parties, July 1933, declared the Nazi Party the only legal party in Germany. Opposition parties were banned, and their leaders were arrested or forced into exile. Political pluralism vanished. Every German citizen was expected to align with Nazi beliefs. Trade unions. On May 2, 1933, trade unions were stormed by Nazi paramilitary groups, and their leaders were imprisoned. In their place, the Nazis established the German Labor Front DAF, which outlawed strikes and collective bargaining. Workers had no choice but to join the DAF, which dictated wages, working hours, and conditions. Local governments. The law for the reconstruction of the Reich, January 1934, dissolved state parliaments and placed regional governments under Nazi control. Germany was no longer a federal system, but a centralized dictatorship. For ordinary Germans, this meant that no alternative voices remained. Whether at work, in school, or in the press, only the Nazi narrative was permitted. Those who resisted were silenced. The control of information. One of the most noticeable changes for everyday Germans came in the realm of information. The Reich Press Law of 1933 placed all journalism under Nazi oversight. Newspapers critical of the regime were shut down, and editors were required to join the Reich Press Chamber, ensuring loyalty to Nazi ideology. Radio, the newest and most influential medium, was brought under control through the Reich Broadcasting Corporation. Cheap radios, called Volksempfänger, or people's receivers, were mass-produced, so that every household could listen to Nazi propaganda. These radios were deliberately designed with limited range, so that Germans could only pick up domestic broadcasts, cutting them off from foreign perspectives. For ordinary families, evening entertainment was no longer just music or drama, but often included Hitler's speeches, news bulletins crafted by Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, and programs that glorified Nazi achievements. The targeting of minorities. From the beginning, Hitler's laws also aimed at excluding groups considered undesirable. The first targets were political opponents, but soon Jews, Roma, Gypsies, and other minorities found themselves marginalized through legislation. In April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service was passed. This law removed Jews and political opponents from government jobs, teaching positions, and other state employment. The same year saw laws banning Jewish doctors from working in state hospitals and Jewish lawyers from practicing in German courts. For many Jewish families, this was the beginning of systematic exclusion. A doctor who had served his community for decades could suddenly be dismissed overnight. A teacher beloved by students could be forced out of the classroom. Ordinary Germans witnessed these changes and often remained silent, either out of fear or agreement with the regime's racial ideology. Everyday impact of early Nazi laws. By the mid-1930s, life in Germany had been completely reshaped. For a typical German citizen, political debate no longer existed. To speak against Hitler was to risk arrest. At work, the German Labor Front dictated wages and banned strikes. At home, radios carried constant propaganda, while newspapers repeated official lines. In schools, children were taught Nazi ideology, including racial doctrines that glorified Aryans and vilified Jews. In neighborhoods, the presence of the Gestapo, the secret state police, created an atmosphere of fear. A careless word could result in a midnight knock on the door. For Jews and other minorities, the impact was harsher. Professional lives were shattered, property rights began to erode, and social exclusion became the norm. Yet for many Aryan Germans, the laws brought not only restrictions, but also a sense of belonging. Hitler had promised order, and through rigid control, he delivered a society that on the surface appeared stable and disciplined. The Nuremberg Laws and the racial reshaping of society. As the Nazi state consolidated power, the early decrees that restricted freedoms and marginalized political opponents gave way to even more radical laws. The focus shifted from silencing dissent to actively engineering a society based on racial ideology. Hitler's regime was not satisfied with mere political control. It sought to reshape the very fabric of German life according to a vision of racial purity. At the heart of this transformation were the infamous Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which formalized discrimination and exclusion in legal terms. They were among the clearest examples of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives. The ideological foundation of racial laws. Hitler and the Nazi leadership believed in the supremacy of what they called the Aryan race, which they described as strong, pure, and destined to rule. This racial worldview was more than just rhetoric. It became the guiding principle of lawmaking. According to Nazi ideology, Jews were considered a biological threat to Aryan purity. The goal was not just social separation, but ultimately the removal of Jews from German life altogether. The state began to codify this ideology through legislation, creating an elaborate system of racial classification that determined who belonged to the people's community, Volksgemeinschaft, and who was excluded. The Nuremberg Laws, September 1935. In September 1935, during the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, Hitler announced a new set of laws that would define the racial state. These became known as the Nuremberg Laws, and they consisted of two key statutes. The Reich Citizenship Law. This law declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens of the Reich. Jews, by definition, were excluded from citizenship. They were reduced to the status of subjects of the state, meaning they were denied political rights and were no longer protected as equal members of society. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor. This law prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. It also banned Jews from employing German women under the age of 45 in their households, a measure justified with a false claim of preventing racial contamination. With these two laws, the Nazi state stripped Jews of both their political rights and their private freedoms. They could no longer participate in the political community, and even their most intimate relationships were subject to state control. Racial classification. To enforce the Nuremberg Laws, the regime needed a way to determine who was Jewish. This led to the development of complex racial classifications. A person with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents was defined as a Jew, regardless of personal belief or practice. Those with 2 Jewish grandparents were classified as half-Jews, Mischlinge of the first degree. Those with 1 Jewish grandparent were considered quarter Jews, Mischlinge of the second degree. This racial logic ignored religious affiliation. A person who had converted to Christianity decades earlier was still defined as Jewish if their grandparents were. Identity was reduced to ancestry, a legal formula that invaded family life and forced people to trace their lineage in order to prove their purity. The impact on everyday life. For Jews in Germany, the Nuremberg Laws marked a devastating turning point. No longer were they simply being pushed out of professions. They were now legally defined as outsiders within their own country. Marriages were torn apart. Couples who had fallen in love before the laws found themselves facing annulment or social persecution. Mixed families lived under suspicion, and their children faced discrimination in schools and in society. Citizenship was lost. Jewish professionals could no longer vote, run for office, or enjoy the protections of full citizens. In many cases, they could not own property without fear of confiscation. Daily humiliation became routine. Signs appeared outside restaurants, parks, and public spaces declaring Jews not wanted. Shops run by Jews were boycotted, and customers who dared enter them risked harassment. For ordinary Germans, the laws sent a chilling signal. Racial discrimination was not just socially acceptable, but legally mandated. Silence or compliance became a form of participation, and many accepted the changes as part of the new normal. Extending the racial laws. The Nuremberg Laws were not static. They served as a foundation for further racial restrictions. Over the next years, a flood of regulations tightened the noose around Jewish existence. Jews were gradually excluded from schools, universities, and professional organizations. Jewish doctors could no longer treat non-Jewish patients. Jewish businesses were targeted for Aryanization, a process where ownership was forcibly transferred to German Aryans at bargain prices. By the late 1930s, Jews were barred from theaters, concert halls, sports clubs, and even from owning radios. The aim was total exclusion, not just from political life, but from cultural and social life as well. The role of propaganda. The racial laws were reinforced through relentless propaganda. Newspapers like Der Stürmer published cartoons that depicted Jews as dangerous and subhuman. Schoolbooks taught children that Jewish blood was poisonous. Films such as Jud Sus and The Eternal Jew spread grotesque stereotypes to mass audiences. Propaganda did more than reflect the laws. It prepared society to accept them. By constantly portraying Jews as corrupt, criminal, or diseased, the regime made discrimination seem not only acceptable, but necessary for the health of the nation. Ordinary Germans internalized these messages, and many came to see racial laws as a defense of their community rather than an attack on their neighbors. Beyond Jews, other targets. While Jews were the primary targets of the Nuremberg Laws, other groups also faced persecution. The Roma people, often called gypsies, were classified as racially inferior and subject to many of the same restrictions. The people with disabilities were targeted under the so-called Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, 1933, which legalized forced sterilization. Homosexuals and political dissidents were criminalized and imprisoned, often sent to concentration camps where they were forced to wear identifying symbols, such as the pink triangle for homosexuals. The Nuremberg Laws and related racial legislation were part of a broader effort to create a racial state that excluded anyone deemed unfit or undesirable. How ordinary Germans responded. The response of ordinary Germans varied. Some enthusiastically embraced the new laws, either out of genuine belief in Nazi ideology or because of personal gain. Many acquired businesses or properties from Jews during the Aryanization process. Others were indifferent, accepting the changes as part of daily life without questioning them. There were also quiet forms of resistance. Some Germans continued friendships or marriages with Jews despite social and legal pressures. A few church leaders spoke out, though most remained silent. But acts of resistance were rare and dangerous. Those who opposed the laws risked losing jobs, freedom, or even their lives. A society reshaped. By 1936, just 3 years after Hitler came to power, Germany had been transformed by law into a society where rights and freedoms were no longer universal, but conditional, granted only to those deemed racially pure. For Jews, the Nuremberg Laws created a legal prison. They lived in the same cities, walked the same streets, and yet they were excluded from the life around them. They were present but invisible, tolerated only until the state decided to push them further out. For other Germans, these laws reinforced conformity. To belong to the Volksgemeinschaft, one had to demonstrate loyalty not only to the regime, but to its racial ideology. The law was no longer a neutral system of rules, but an instrument of ideological control, shaping identity, behavior, and even morality. These Nuremberg Laws stood as the clearest demonstration of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, revealing how law could be twisted into a weapon that dismantled both individual freedoms and human dignity. Youth, women, and family under Nazi law. By the mid-1930s, Germany was no longer a democracy, but a society meticulously reshaped through Hitler's legal framework. The Nuremberg Laws had drawn the boundaries of racial exclusion, but the Nazis also understood that their vision could only survive if the younger generation and the family unit itself were molded to reflect the ideology of the Reich. To achieve this, the regime turned its attention to schools, youth organizations, women's roles, and family life, imposing regulations that reached into the most personal aspects of daily existence. These were also part of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, because they dictated how Germans should live, love, marry, and even raise their children. Controlling education. One of the earliest targets of Nazi control was education. The regime recognized that schools could either preserve or destroy its future. Thus, they were coordinated, brought under Gleichschaltung, to serve as instruments of indoctrination. Curriculum restructuring. History lessons glorified German victories, while World War I was portrayed not as a defeat, but as a betrayal by Jews and communists. Biology classes were transformed into vehicles for racial theory. Students learned about racial hygiene and the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Physical education was given unprecedented importance. The aim was not merely fitness, but preparation for future soldiers and mothers of the Aryan state. Teachers under watch. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, pledging loyalty to Hitler. Those who resisted or were Jewish were dismissed. Teachers were expected not just to instruct, but to serve as political guardians, reporting students or families that showed signs of dissent. For German children, school was no longer a neutral environment of learning. It became a place where ideology shaped every subject, and where loyalty to Hitler was more important than knowledge itself. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls. Beyond the classroom, Nazi law and policy ensured that children were absorbed into organizations designed to shape them into obedient citizens. Hitler Youth, Hitlerjugend by law. Membership became compulsory in 1936. Boys were trained in military discipline, marching, camping, and weapons handling. More than leisure, it was preparation for war. League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel for Girls. The organization emphasized domestic skills, loyalty, and physical fitness for motherhood. These groups blurred the line between state and family. Parents who discouraged participation could face fines, social ostracism, or worse. For many children, loyalty to Hitler became stronger than loyalty to their own parents. Women and Nazi law. The Nazi regime saw women not as equals, but as the bearers of the next generation of the Aryan race. Hitler's laws concerning women focused on one thing: their role as mothers. The Law for the Encouragement of Marriage, 1933. Newly married couples were offered loans of up to 1,000 Reichsmarks, but the loan was reduced by 25% for each child born. Essentially, the more children a family had, the less debt they carried. This law incentivized childbirth, especially within racially pure marriages. Exclusion from the workforce. Laws and policies pushed women out of professional life. Women doctors, lawyers, and civil servants were dismissed or restricted. Instead, women were encouraged or compelled to focus on the so-called three Ks: Kinder, Kush, Kirche, Children, Kitchen, Church. Motherhood Awards. The regime introduced the Mother's Cross of Honor, awarded to women who bore many children for the Reich. Bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. Motherhood itself became a civic duty, celebrated as a patriotic contribution equal to a soldier's service. Through these measures, women were legally redefined not as individuals with careers and ambitions, but as vessels of the nation's future. Marriage and family regulation. The Nazis were obsessed with controlling marriage and reproduction. The aim was not only to promote childbirth, but to ensure that only racially pure couples produced children. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor, part of the Nuremberg framework, forbade intermarriage between Jews and Aryans. Violations were considered a crime. Marriage health certificates. Couples had to prove their racial purity and health before being allowed to marry. Those with hereditary illnesses or deemed unfit could be sterilized under the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. Even intimate family decisions were no longer private. The state determined who was eligible to marry, who could reproduce, and who must be excluded. Sterilization and racial hygiene. One of the most chilling aspects of Hitler's laws was the sterilization program, justified under the language of racial hygiene. Beginning in 1933, courts could order forced sterilizations for people suffering from conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary blindness, or even alcoholism. Between 1934 and 1939, an estimated 400,000 Germans were sterilized against their will. Families had little choice but to comply, and victims bore the stigma of being considered unfit. These measures went beyond discrimination. They intruded into the most basic human right, the right to have children, under the guise of improving the racial health of the nation. Everyday consequences for families. For ordinary Germans, The intrusion of Hitler's laws into family life was inescapable. A couple in love might be prevented from marrying because of ancestry or health checks. A mother might receive state honors for bearing children, but her friend could be sterilized for an inherited illness. Parents who resisted sending their children to Hitler Youth events risked punishment, while their children might report them under encouragement from teachers or peers. The home, traditionally a private refuge, became another arena of state control. Family decisions about marriage, education, and even leisure were judged not by personal desire, but by Nazi law, public morality, and behavior. Hitler's regime also extended legal oversight to morality. Laws targeted behaviors deemed un-German or dangerous to the Volksgemeinschaft. Homosexuality was criminalized more severely under paragraph 175 of the Penal Code, with thousands arrested and sent to concentration camps. Abortion was banned for racially pure women, but encouraged, even forced, for Jews, Roma, and others considered undesirable. Cultural life, books, theater, art, and even music was regulated to ensure moral conformity with Nazi ideals. Thus, family, sexuality, and private choices were no longer personal freedoms. They were governed by Hitler's laws, illustrating again how these were truly the strict rules that changed German lives, shaping the next generation. By embedding ideology into schools, youth groups, and family laws, the Nazis created a system where children grew up knowing nothing but Hitler's worldview. A boy trained in the Hitler Youth and taught racial superiority at school would grow into a soldier ready for war. A girl raised in the League of German Girls, educated in domesticity, would see her life's purpose as motherhood for the Reich. The continuity of Nazi power relied not only on propaganda and violence, but on laws that reached deep into the formative years of its people, binding future generations to the ideology. The deepening control. By the late 1930s, Nazi Germany was not just a dictatorship in the political sense. It was a state where laws dictated the most intimate aspects of life, what children learned, how families were structured, who could marry, and who could bear children. These laws were not abstract regulations. They were living realities that every German family encountered, whether through school policies, marriage certificates, or youth organizations. In this way, Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, became more than a slogan. They were the framework of a society where individuality was sacrificed for the collective racial vision, and where the family itself was remolded into an instrument of the state. As the Nazi regime tightened its grip on every aspect of German life, the intersection of ideology and law became even more pronounced. By the mid to late 1930s, the regime had already created a society where loyalty to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party was not only expected, but legally enforced. What had started as a series of discriminatory regulations against political opponents, and Jews soon expanded into a wide-ranging system of strict laws that reshaped daily existence for millions. These rules were not merely bureaucratic decrees. They were instruments of control designed to regulate how people lived, worked, prayed, studied, and even thought. It was within this climate that Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, revealed their most suffocating power. One of the most striking features of Nazi legislation during this period was the militarization of society. The reintroduction of conscription in 1935 had already forced young German men into the armed services, but the reach of militarism extended well beyond the barracks. Civil laws increasingly aligned with military goals, requiring civilians to adopt behaviors and attitudes that supported the broader project of war preparation. For example, rationing measures and economic restrictions were framed not just as financial necessities, but as patriotic duties. Citizens were taught through propaganda and law that sacrificing personal comfort was part of their obligation to the state. Workplaces were another central battleground for the Nazis' legal control. The creation of the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, DAF, eliminated free trade unions and imposed strict rules on workers and employers alike. Strikes became illegal, wages were regulated by the state, and working conditions were dictated with a supposed aim of promoting national community. Workers were compelled to participate in state-organized leisure programs, such as the Strength Through Joy movement, which offered subsidized vacations and cultural events. While these programs appeared generous on the surface, they were in reality another tool of surveillance and indoctrination. Attendance was monitored, and participation became a silent signal of loyalty. Employers, too, were forced to comply with regulations, aligning their business practices with the goals of the Nazi state. Equally significant was the control over education. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls had already been made mandatory, but schools themselves were bound by increasingly strict rules. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League, ensuring that they adhered to the party line. Curricula were rewritten to emphasize racial theory, physical fitness, and loyalty to Hitler above all else. History was distorted to glorify Germany's past while demonizing enemies, particularly Jews and communists. Science was manipulated to promote racial superiority theories. In practice, this meant that children grew up in a carefully constructed reality where every law, every lesson, and every ritual reinforced the Nazi worldview. The strictness of these rules meant that dissenting teachers could be dismissed or even arrested, while students who resisted indoctrination risked social isolation and punishment. Religion posed a unique challenge for the Nazis, as churches and faith traditions had deep roots in German life. Hitler initially sought a compromise, signing the Concordat with the Vatican in 1933, which promised to protect Catholic institutions in exchange for political neutrality. But by the late 1930s, it was clear that the Nazi state viewed religion as a rival source of authority. Laws were increasingly passed to weaken the influence of churches. Catholic schools faced closure, youth groups were banned, and priests who criticized the regime were arrested under charges of treason. Protestants were pushed toward the German Christian movement, which sought to fuse Nazi ideology with Christianity by eliminating references to the Old Testament and reframing Jesus as a heroic Aryan figure. For everyday Germans, these laws meant difficult choices: comply and compromise their faith, or resist and face the consequences. Cultural life, too, was reshaped through rigid control. Laws regulated what music could be performed, what plays could be staged, and what art could be displayed. The infamous degenerate art exhibitions of 1937 mocked modernist works, labeling them un-German, while promoting works that celebrated Nazi values like heroism, purity, and rural simplicity. Jazz, swing, and other forms associated with African American or Jewish culture were banned. Musicians and artists who failed to conform faced censorship, exile, or worse. These rules were not only about suppressing dissent, but also about constructing a cultural environment that constantly mirrored the state's ideology back at the population. The laws governing women's lives became particularly restrictive during this period. Nazi ideology viewed women primarily as mothers and homemakers, responsible for raising the next generation of Aryan citizens. Laws barred women from many professions, restricted their access to higher education, and rewarded large families with financial incentives and medals, such as the Mother's Cross. Abortion was harshly criminalized for Aryan women, but perversely encouraged for those deemed racially undesirable. The state's obsession with racial purity infiltrated the most intimate aspects of women's lives, turning family decisions into matters of law. For German women, the strict rules meant their identities and choices were legally confined to the service of Hitler's vision of the nation. Equally invasive were the laws that regulated personal expression and behavior. Germans were required to greet each other with the Nazi salute in public, while displaying loyalty symbols became obligatory in schools, workplaces, and even private homes. Failure to comply could draw suspicion or denunciation. The Gestapo's system of informants meant that neighbors, co-workers, or even family members could report individuals who appeared insufficiently committed to the regime. This climate of fear ensured that the strict rules were obeyed, not only out of legal obligation, but also from the constant anxiety of surveillance. The Nazi legal system extended its reach into criminal law as well. Ordinary offenses like theft or vandalism were punished with disproportionate severity. particularly if they were perceived as undermining the war effort or the national community. Special courts were created to handle cases of political dissent, where defendants often faced swift and brutal sentences. The People's Court Volksgerichtshof, presided over by the notorious Judge Roland Freisler, became infamous for its harsh rulings, which often ended in execution. Here, the principle of justice was entirely replaced by the principle of loyalty to the Führer. By the late 1930s, the cumulative weight of these laws meant that there was almost no aspect of life untouched by the regime. Work, family, religion, culture, education, and leisure were all bound by regulations that reinforced the Nazi vision of society. The laws were strict not only in their wording, but also in their enforcement, creating a world where personal choice was sacrificed to state control. It is in this period that one can most clearly see the meaning of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives. They were not abstract political decrees, but tangible forces that governed daily routines, shaped identities, and determined futures. Whether through the banning of a favorite book, the arrest of a trusted priest, or the forced participation in propaganda events, ordinary Germans experienced the impact of these rules in countless ways. And yet, as rigid and controlling as the laws already were, they were only a prelude to what was to come. With the outbreak of World War II, the Nazi regime would extend its reach even further, reshaping laws to serve the demands of war and the machinery of genocide. In the next phase of this story, the rules would not only regulate German lives, but also determine the fate of millions across occupied Europe. By the late 1930s, Germany had become a nation where almost every corner of public and private life was touched by the iron grip of the regime. The web of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, was not confined only to Jews, political opponents, or those considered outsiders. It reached deeply into the homes of ordinary Germans, dictating how they worked, what they consumed, and even how they thought. At this stage, laws became less about single decrees and more about a carefully constructed machine of social engineering. One of the most telling examples of this engineering was the four-year plan introduced in 1936 under Hermann Göring's control. Officially, the plan aimed to prepare Germany for war within 4 years, but its impact on daily life was immediate. Workers found themselves drafted into industries deemed crucial for the Reich: steel, coal, armaments, and chemical production. Consumer goods, once accessible to families, became increasingly scarce. Shoes, coffee, and meat were rationed informally even before the war began. Laws restricted imports, and German households were expected to embrace the doctrine of autarky, or self-sufficiency. Even leisure was tailored to this ideology. Women were encouraged to cook with substitutes, using rye instead of wheat, turnip instead of potatoes, or ersatz coffee made from chicory. These laws and directives were presented as patriotic sacrifices, yet they imposed a constant strain on German lives. The Nazi leadership also doubled down on the cultural sphere. Censorship laws intensified, ensuring that the arts reflected only approved themes: German nationalism, militarism, and loyalty to Hitler. Books that questioned these values were banned, and Jewish authors were systematically erased from libraries and schools. Even popular music was reshaped by law. Jazz, labeled as degenerate and associated with African American and Jewish musicians, was banned. Families who once gathered around radios for entertainment now had their choices limited to state broadcasts, military marches, or carefully censored operas. Listening to foreign radio became a criminal act, punishable by imprisonment. Through these laws, not only were voices silenced, but the very rhythm of German life was recalibrated to march in lockstep with Nazi ideology. As part of this tightening grip, the regime extended legal control over education. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls were already compulsory, but new laws ensured that schools became an echo chamber of state propaganda. Teachers who resisted were dismissed or denounced. Textbooks carried anti-Semitic caricatures, glorified Aryan soldiers, and repeated slogans about loyalty to Hitler. Even mathematics problems were restructured. Children would solve questions framed around calculating bullets or comparing the costs of housing Aryan versus Jewish families. This wasn't merely education, it was indoctrination, and the laws guaranteed that no child could escape it. By 1938, a turning point came with what is often called the radicalization of anti-Jewish laws. Jews were barred from practicing medicine, law, or owning businesses. They were forbidden from attending theaters, concerts, or even using public parks. Every aspect of leisure, commerce, and social interaction became segregated. One particularly cruel regulation required Jewish men to add Israel to their names and women to add Sarah, so their identity as Jews could never be hidden. Passports were stamped with a large red J. These laws reduced once respected professionals and neighbors to outsiders in their own homeland. The culmination of this radicalization was Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, in November 1938. Though technically sparked by a single event, the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish teenager, the pogrom was state-orchestrated. Laws ensured that the police did not intervene as Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were destroyed. Afterward, a new wave of legislation followed. Jews were fined collectively for the damage, forbidden from owning property, and excluded from attending German schools altogether. What had begun with legal discrimination in 1933 had now spiraled into legalized terror. Yet it wasn't only minorities who suffered under these strict rules. Ordinary Germans also faced harsh laws regarding loyalty. The Gestapo, empowered by broad legal authority, could arrest anyone suspected of disloyalty. A careless joke about Hitler, a whispered criticism of the war preparations, even failure to display the swastika flag on national holidays, all could lead to interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. Neighbors informed on one another, and children were encouraged by law to report unpatriotic behavior, even within their families. The private sphere shrank as the laws blurred the boundary between home and state. The militarization of society further reshaped everyday existence. The 1935 Reich Defense Law had already laid the groundwork, but by the late 1930s, conscription became widespread. Families watched as their sons were drafted into the army, their futures determined not by choice, but by decree. Civilian laborers, too, were redirected to state projects, highways, armament factories, or agricultural schemes. Even entertainment was militarized. Sports clubs were reorganized under Nazi law to emphasize physical fitness for future soldiers, while women's groups trained girls in domestic skills meant to support soldiers and produce healthy future Aryans. One cannot overlook the profound psychological effect of these laws. The regime had achieved something rare in history. It fused legislation with ideology so completely that even the most personal aspects of life became politicized. Clothing styles, hairstyles, dating choices, and holiday celebrations all became subject to scrutiny. A law banning Jewish-German intermarriage wasn't only a legal barrier. It reshaped how young people thought about love and relationships. A law mandating Nazi greetings in schools wasn't just protocol. It transformed how children interacted with authority. These laws were not merely written on paper. They were etched into the daily rhythm of existence. By the eve of war in 1939, Germans lived under a system where every decision, from the food on their table to the songs they sang, was shaped by Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives. The transformation was so complete that many no longer remembered a time when life was different. For some, this new reality offered a sense of order, security, and belonging. For others, it was suffocating, stripping away individuality, diversity, and freedom. But regardless of personal opinion, one fact was undeniable. The strict rules had created a society entirely subservient to the vision of Adolf Hitler. As the Nazi state marched deeper into the late 1930s and into the war years, the scope of its legal machinery expanded to cover nearly every corner of German life. By now, the ordinary German citizen lived in a society where each decision, whether to marry, to read a certain book, to speak a casual thought at work, or even to buy from a certain shop, was regulated by Hitler's laws. These laws were not simply abstract decrees. They were lived realities that reshaped culture, morality, and the very way people interacted with one another. The phrase Hitler's laws The strict rules that changed German lives wasn't merely an idea. It was a daily, inescapable truth. One of the most striking aspects of this legal system was its totalitarian penetration into private life. Unlike traditional governments that largely confined their influence to taxes, criminal codes, or property rights, the Nazis turned law into a weapon of ideological engineering. The household itself became a site of control. Families were expected to raise children as loyal subjects of the Führer. Mothers who refused to follow state-mandated education practices risked being reported. Even games, toys, and bedtime stories were infused with propaganda, teaching children to revere Hitler and despise the enemies of the Reich. Through such micro-level control, Hitler's laws ensured that the family unit itself became an extension of the Nazi state. But while the private family was reshaped, so too was the public space. The Nuremberg Laws had already redrawn who could belong to German society, but follow-up decrees in the late 1930s and early 1940s went even further. Jews were banned from using public parks, theaters, and swimming pools. In many towns, signs sprang up reading, "Jews not wanted here." These restrictions were not just about exclusion, they were about humiliation. They reminded both Jews and so-called Aryans that the law defined them unequally. For ordinary Germans, seeing their neighbors excluded from public life normalized the idea that the state had the right to strip entire groups of their humanity. This public segregation extended into the economic sphere as well. By 1938, Jews had been systematically removed from nearly all professions. Lawyers, doctors, professors, business owners. None were safe. One infamous law required Jews to register their assets, paving the way for widespread confiscation of property and businesses, often handed directly to Aryan Germans in a process called Aryanization. For those who benefited, this reinforced loyalty to the regime. For those who lost, it was devastating. Once again, Hitler's laws reshaped lives not in theory, but in direct, material terms. Families who had built wealth over generations were reduced to poverty overnight, while others enriched themselves by exploiting their neighbors' dispossession. At the same time, wartime laws tightened control over everyone in Germany. Curfews were imposed, rationing became strict, and laws dictated not only what people could eat, but how much. Violating ration rules could result in severe punishment, sometimes even prison or death. For women, laws intensified their expected roles as mothers and laborers for the Reich. Marriage loans, medals for childbearing, and propaganda campaigns reinforced the image of the German woman as the bearer of future soldiers. Yet, as men went off to fight, women were simultaneously required to fill labor shortages in factories and farms. The contradiction was striking. Women were celebrated for staying at home, but punished if they refused to serve when the state demanded it. Perhaps one of the most chilling elements of Hitler's legal framework was the legalization of medical crimes. Under the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, doctors were ordered to sterilize individuals deemed unfit, including those with mental illnesses, physical disabilities, or even conditions like alcoholism. Later, this expanded into the so-called euthanasia program, where laws permitted the killing of institutionalized patients. These killings were presented as mercy deaths, but in reality, they were part of a broader campaign of biological engineering. Here, the cruelty of Hitler's laws became undeniable. The state not only stripped rights, but extinguished lives, all under the guise of legality. The overlap between law and war was also profound. Military law became an instrument of terror within the armed forces themselves. Soldiers could be executed for desertion, defeatism, or even speaking critically of Hitler. Civilians, too, were caught in this tightening net. During the later years of the war, laws punished defeatist talk, spreading rumors, questioning victory, or even expressing sympathy for bombing victims could lead to arrest by the Gestapo. In this climate, silence became survival. Conversations shrank, friendships dissolved, and even family members feared betrayal. The sense that the law was everywhere, listening and watching, turned society into a nation of whispers. Propaganda laws amplified this effect. By controlling newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts, The regime ensured that citizens consumed only state-approved information. But it was not enough to passively consume propaganda. Citizens were also expected to demonstrate loyalty. Attendance at Nazi rallies, participation in parades, and public displays of support for the war effort were legally and socially enforced. Failure to participate could result in accusations of disloyalty. Thus, even silence or absence could be criminalized. Once again, Hitler's laws transformed ordinary behaviors into matters of legal consequence. It is also worth noting the intergenerational impact of these rules. Children raised under Nazi law absorbed a worldview that was deeply distorted. Through organizations like the Hitler Youth, the laws regulated what games they played, what songs they sang, and even how they greeted each other. Heil Hitler was not a choice, but a legal and social necessity. Schools eliminated Jewish teachers, rewrote textbooks, and emphasized racial theory. For many children, this was the only reality they knew. The law did not just control them, it shaped their very identities. By the early 1940s, as the war escalated and Germany turned to mass violence and genocide, the machinery of law played a central role in facilitating atrocities. Deportation orders, property seizures, and transport regulations all bore the appearance of bureaucratic legality. For those carrying them out, it was just following the law. For those victimized, it meant there was no avenue of appeal, no chance of justice. Law itself had become the mask of tyranny. The paradox was stark. Under Hitler's regime, law was everywhere, but justice was nowhere. The rules were strict, detailed, and inescapable. But their very purpose was to strip away dignity, freedom, and life itself. What had begun as political decrees had expanded into a totalizing system where every German, willingly or unwillingly, lived under the shadow of Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives. And yet, even in such suffocating conditions, small acts of resistance persisted. Some Germans risked their lives to hide Jews, to spread forbidden leaflets, or to listen to foreign radio broadcasts. These acts, though rare and dangerous, revealed that even the strictest laws could not completely extinguish the human spirit. But the risk of being caught was severe. Laws against treason, sedition, or aiding enemies carried the death penalty. For most, the cost of defiance was simply too high. As the war dragged on and Allied bombs fell on German cities, daily survival became the central preoccupation. And even here, the laws remained present. Looting ruins could result in execution. Failing to obey air raid rules was punishable. And complaining about the regime could still bring a knock on the door at night. In every sense, law had been weaponized against the very people it was supposed to protect. Part 7. Total Control and the Lasting Impact of Hitler's Laws. By the early 1940s, Germany had become a society almost entirely molded by Nazi ideology. Every law, every rule, every restriction was designed to ensure one thing: complete obedience to Hitler and his vision. From the outside, the system seemed efficient, orderly, and unified. But beneath that facade, German citizens lived under a suffocating net of rules that dictated nearly every detail of their lives. These were not just ordinary regulations, but extraordinary commands, laws that reached deep into private life. By now, the Nuremberg Laws had stripped Jews of citizenship, professional restrictions had silenced intellectuals and scientists, and even children in schools were subjected to rigid Nazi indoctrination. Hitler's laws were not just legal texts, they were tools of transformation. They sought to turn an entire nation into instruments of the regime. But what was it like to live in this system every day? Let us step into the daily life of a German under the Nazi regime in the later years of World War II. The economy under rule. For most families, the economy was no longer about choice, but about survival. Food rationing had become severe. The government issued ration cards, and failure to comply with rationing rules could result in harsh punishment. Black market trading was technically illegal, yet it became widespread because many families couldn't survive on official rations alone. Even luxury items, like coffee, chocolate, or foreign goods, were strictly banned or heavily restricted. These controls were framed as necessary for the war effort, But they also served to remind people that the state controlled not just politics, but their dinner tables, too. And work was not exempt from control. Every able-bodied German was expected to contribute to the war economy. Men went to the front, while women were increasingly pushed into factories, farms, or auxiliary services. Failure to comply with these work directives was seen not as laziness, but as treason. Laws that governed thought. It wasn't just material goods that were restricted, it was thought itself. Ordinary Germans had to be extremely careful about what they said in public, even in private. The Gestapo had an extensive network of informants, and neighbors or co-workers could report someone for making an anti-Hitler remark. This meant that people lived in constant fear. A joke told at the wrong time, a comment overheard by the wrong person. These could destroy a family. The law did not merely punish crime, it punished dissent, even when that dissent was whispered inside the home. In this way, Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives, were not just about overt control. They were about silencing the very possibility of opposition. Religion under watch. Religious life, too, was reshaped. Churches technically remained open, but Nazi laws worked steadily to erode their independence. Christian youth groups were banned, replaced by the Hitler Youth. Sermons were monitored, and pastors who dared criticize the regime faced prison or worse. Some clergy complied, altering their sermons to avoid confrontation. Others resisted, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spoke against Nazi policies and was executed for his defiance. The fact that even religion, the most private and spiritual part of people's lives, was subject to Hitler's laws shows how deeply the regime intruded into every sphere of existence. Youth in the final years. Children growing up in this environment knew almost no other life. For them, Nazi ideology was reality. The Hitler Youth and League of German Girls dictated their free time, their education, and even their moral code. A child who failed to participate might face punishment, and their parents could be accused of being uncooperative with the regime. These organizations drilled into young people the idea of loyalty to Hitler above family, faith, or conscience. The laws here were subtle yet devastating. They didn't just create citizens loyal to the state, they sought to create an entirely new generation programmed to think like Nazis. War and desperation. As the war turned against Germany, laws grew harsher. Curfews were imposed. Propaganda warned citizens not to listen to foreign radio, and doing so became a crime punishable by imprisonment. Laws against defeatism meant that anyone who expressed doubt about victory could be arrested. In 1944 and 1945, as Allied bombing campaigns intensified, Hitler's regime doubled down on control. Ordinary Germans were required to participate in Volkssturm, the national militia that drafted old men and young boys to defend the collapsing Reich. Refusal to fight could result in execution. It was in these final desperate years that the cruelty of Hitler's legal system became undeniable. The same system that had begun with promises of order and prosperity had reduced its citizens to subjects of fear, hunger, and endless war. The collapse. When the regime finally collapsed in 1945, many Germans were left asking, how did this happen? How had they allowed their lives to be so thoroughly taken over by laws that, in hindsight, were deeply unjust and destructive? The truth is that these laws didn't appear all at once. They crept in gradually. First, laws targeting small groups, political enemies, Jews, journalists. Then, laws reshaping daily life, work, schools, religion. Finally, laws that controlled thought itself. By the time most people realized how deep the control ran, it was too late. Resistance was nearly impossible, and the system had consumed everything. A warning from history. And this brings us to the conclusion of our journey through Hitler's laws, the strict rules that changed German lives. We've seen how rules designed to unify a nation instead suffocated it. We've seen how laws stripped away freedoms piece by piece until people no longer had control over their jobs, their schools, their churches, even their own words. We've seen how the legal system itself, something meant to protect citizens, was turned into a weapon against them. The story of these laws is not just history, it is a warning. It reminds us that tyranny does not always come with chaos. Sometimes it comes with order. It comes with laws and regulations that appear harmless at first, but gradually reshape society into something unrecognizable. For the German people, the cost was devastating. Their lives were ruled by fear, their freedoms destroyed, and their nation dragged into a war that left the world scarred. Today, when we study these laws, we are reminded that freedom must be defended not only from violence, but also from the slow erosion of rights through unjust rules. Because once laws stop protecting people and start controlling them, the path can lead only to oppression. And that is the legacy of Hitler's laws, a chilling example of how rules can change lives, not for the better, but for the worst.